Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Liz Ritchie and I have the honour of being the CEO of the Regional Australia Institute. I'd like to warmly welcome all of our attendees today to our second webinar, Regions Rising 2020. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and pay our respects to elders both past and present. Today our topic is the big population reveal, where we're going to give you an insight into the population trends and movement that we've seen, which will focus on regional Australia. Far too often, the narrative is that people are leaving the regions in droves, and now we have the evidence to support that this is in fact not true. Yesterday, we launched our new report called The Big Movers to the media, and my colleague Dr. Kim Houghton and I have had a wonderful 24 hours talking to media right across our nation. There's a story for every regional centre in this report, and we look forward to unpacking that with you here today in today's webinar. I'd also like to acknowledge and warmly welcome our guests and panellists here today. As I said, Dr. Kim Houghton will be presenting. We're also welcoming Nerida Conisbee, who's the Chief Economist with the REA Group, perhaps more widely known as realestate.com. So welcome to Nerida. And Chris Bilkey, who's the Mayor of the Murray River Council. Welcome to all of our panellists, and thank you very much for being with us today. Before I move on into today's session, I would like to just take a moment to acknowledge the Bendigo and Adelaide Bank and their charitable arm, the Community Enterprise Foundation, as our major national sponsor for Regions Rising. This is the second year that they have supported our Regions Rising National Series, and we're very grateful for that support and very much enjoy working with an organisation that is so passionate and invested in regional Australia. So thank you for that support. They're also really excited to support the webinar series explicitly because of the opportunity that it provides a more inclusive and accessible platform. And as this is our second, we're very pleased to see that we have over 800 people joining us here again today. So that seems to be working. Thank you. Today's program, we only have one short hour together, so we really do need to make the most of this time. After a couple of opening remarks, we'll move straight to the panel, and then we'll be leaving about 15 minutes for audience Q&A. We are going to open up the panel Q&A session, so you have the opportunity as participants to put in your question, and then obviously we won't have time to get to every question, unfortunately, but please do put those questions forward, and our team behind the scenes will alert you if your question's been successful, and then the microphone will be open to you. Couple of housekeeping matters before we begin. We have a number of media registered here today, so of course we warmly welcome them. This session is recorded and will be available to anyone after the event who was unable to attend. All the program and speaker bios have been sent out, and also a link to today's report. We'd also love you to get vocal on social media, so be sure to use the hashtag Regions Rising, and you can also tag us at Regional Oz. So quick introduction to today. The theme is, of course, the population reveal. In May, we did launch the headline numbers that we see 65,000 more people choosing regional Australia in the last census period from 2011 to 2016 over the cities. Today, our panel are going to help us unpack those population trends and discuss the findings that we're seeing within the report. what it's revealed, without giving too much away, is that we are an extremely mobile nation. And in fact, Australians have a propensity to change their address at twice the rate of our OECD friends. So we're genuinely really excited by that fact and believe that this is a big opportunity for regions. We hope that this webinar will be a starting point for many regions to better understand their own mobility and population flow. And of course, we look forward to talking with regions right around the nation to help you better understand this information. As I'm sure all of you have either read in the media or experienced for yourself in your workplaces, COVID has really changed the landscape of employment and of our workplaces. And we at the Institute have been a big advocate for promoting this. We believe that the experience of COVID has essentially fast-tracked the future of work. And in May, we were fortunate to launch a new initiative called the Regional Australia Council 2031, where we're working with 10 of our major corporate organisations around the country. So happy to talk to our listeners more about that. But I guess essentially, if employment is no longer if location is no longer a barrier for employment, we know this presents all kinds of opportunities and advantages for regional Australia. And perhaps if I'm bold enough to use my crystal ball, it's possible that the trend line that we've seen here in population movement may indeed be a greater swing to the regions in the new normal. So on that note, I'd like to open to our panelists, and starting today is Dr. Kim Houghton, who's going to provide, who's the author of the Big Movers Report with he and our research team here, but also he's going to provide a much deeper analysis about what's within the report. So thank you, Kim.
Thank you, thank you, Liz, and thanks everyone for joining us. I'll run through the main findings of the report over about 15 minutes, so I'll just share my screen. There we go, hopefully it'll work. And I'll bring this presentation up. There we go, is that looking all right?
Looking great.
Okay, great, all right. So 3 main topics this morning: changing people, the way the population is changing in different parts of Australia, what that means for regions, as Liz said, in terms of working with that mobility rather than fighting it in many cases, and finish up with a bit of an update on our concept of a national campaign to promote living in regions. So firstly, you know, in Institute, we often find we're in a position of busting some myths. And in truth, when we look at all of this data comes from the 2011 to 2016 census. So it's getting a little bit old now, but we did look at the 2006 to 2011 census as well. And the trends that I'll be talking about here are actually quite long running underlying trends. I mean, there's movement around regional Australia, which is very opportunity dependent. So during the mining boom, for instance, we saw big flows of people into those mining areas. For many of those also, those flows came out again. People left again once those big employment prospects for those mining areas deteriorated. So it is opportunistic, but we think that we're seeing here these sort of long-term trends at least over the last decade, and it'll be very interesting to see how it plays out over the next 5 to 10 years in relation to people's preferences, the ageing of our different demographics, and the impacts of COVID-19. So between 2011 and 2016, I think it is important to notice that it's a myth that populations are declining across all of regional Australia. Across the board, different types of regions have all grown. We use 4 different types of regions to emphasise the diversity of regions. So we know that some regions are just outside the capital cities, and then some regions are further outside those again. And we think about our sort of heartland regions, they're the most rural parts of the country. But when we look at those 4 regional types, regional cities grew fairly strongly. The connected lifestyle regions, which are the ones on the periphery of our greater capital cities, they grew even more strongly. They sort of essentially mirrored the growth in the capital cities. Our industry and service hubs, our sort of medium-sized towns in regional Australia grew somewhat as well. But even our heartland regions en masse did show some growth over 2011 to 2016. Now, that doesn't mean that some places aren't losing population. When you look at the pattern of populations change over time in Australia, there is a bit of a sea of red around the middle. We see a lot of decline in populations in the central parts and the most remote parts of regional Australia. Some of those declines are relatively small, but they still show up as declines, quite rightly. We find that there's about 40 LGAs that have lost more than about 500 people over that 5 years. That's 100 people a year over 5 years. That's starting to get pretty significant. It is concentrated in a few areas, in a few places. So I just wanted to sort of set that context, because there is a diversity of places in regional Australia, from large to very small and villages and more outlying remote places. And the pattern of mobility and the pattern of population flow in those is different, and it's very important to recognise that as we go through. So what we tried to do in this piece of research, we really focused in on not so much the movement across regions, although we've done a bit of work on that, but the movement between the capital cities and the regions. And that was to really explore this myth, or explore this sort of perception that generally the regions are losing population to the cities. Like most industrialised countries, there's an urban drift where regions are losing population and cities are growing. Where you draw the boundary on this is very important, because it changes the way that the headline numbers look quite significantly. So we looked at a number of different options, and we ended up settling with the ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, definition of a greater capital city, which draws a boundary, quite a wide boundary around each of the mainland capital cities. So it does pick up some of those outerlying, it picks up all the outlying suburbs, and in many cases, some of the hinterland adjacent to those ones. So that's our definition of what a capital city is, those greater capital city areas. So in this analysis, those are the metro areas, they're the greater capitals. Everything else is regional. Now that's a little bit challenging. It's always difficult to sort of meet people's expectations on these, because we know that means that places like Newcastle, Wollongong, even the Gold Coast are on this definition actually regional, because they're outside those greater capital cities. So that's why we look within the data again to see, okay, that's capital cities and regions. What about different parts of regions? What about those peripheral areas, those connected lifestyle areas? How are they tracking? What about the regional cities? How are they tracking? So we've done that sort of analysis in the report as well. The headline numbers I'll go through today are really focused on that greater capital city to everywhere else kind of mobility. And we looked at the mobility from the greater capital city to another greater capital city, and to the regions, and vice versa. And that gives us a nice picture of where people have been moving from and to. The base information for this was the 2011 and 2006 censuses, because that does give us information about where people lived, where they currently live, and where they lived 5 years before. So the headline numbers here, and this is where it's sort of, Australia looks a little bit different to most of our OECD colleagues. Over that time period, our two largest cities, Melbourne and Sydney, actually shed people. There were more people moved from those cities to regions than moved from regions to those cities. Sydney in the order of 65,000 people over that 5 years, Melbourne about 21,500, and Adelaide a very small loss of around 1,000 people. We know that with Sydney in particular, when the ABS looks at sort of movement of people within Australia on a sort of year-to-year basis, Sydney's been losing about 20 to 25,000 people on that internal mobility in Australia every year for the last 6 or 7 years. So there's a steady pattern of people, lots of people moving into Sydney, but even more moving out of Sydney. So Sydney's growth, Sydney's overall population growth, is due to the babies that people are popping out in Sydney, and those large inflows of new migrants to Sydney, and Melbourne's the same. So that mobility story is quite important for the capital cities. Other cities, Brisbane's been the standout of the larger cities in terms of being attractive to people from all around regional Australia. It had a net loss of people from regions, and Perth as well. Perth's interesting in this case because we did straddle that peak of the labour-intensive part of the mining boom, which sort of peaked around 2012, 2013. So you'll see in some of the data that we've got in the report, there are very large flows of people to mining areas, but there are also very large flows for many of those areas out of those mining areas as that boom started to come off. One of the things that surprised us a little bit was the extent of mobility within states. So most of the movement within most of the states is coming from other parts of the state. So from Sydney, most of the people move to another part of regional New South Wales. Same is true for Queensland, slightly less so for Melbourne. Slightly less so for Hobart as well, because Tasmanians, Hobartians in particular, tend to move to Victoria just as much as they move to regional Tasmania. That's an important sort of element there, because we know that for those regional places that are really keen to build their population bases, those smaller settlements and those outlying settlements, we know that around population, that they're often thinking about how to attract and retain population. And what this starts to tell us is, rather than trying to sort of market more broadly to another state and to another region, it's quite likely that you can pick up on and you can sort of augment and accentuate the flows that are already happening within your state. So if you're in far western New South Wales, for instance, and you were looking to build your population growth, it's fairly clear from this sort of data that the natural pattern for people is to move within their state. So marketing to other people in regional New South Wales would be a good foundation for those sort of marketing campaigns. These are the headline numbers that we're talking about in the report, and there's a couple of things I want to highlight here. Firstly, if you look in the bottom right-hand corner, we've got over 2 million people moved from one capital city to another. So that's where the bulk of the mobility is happening, from one capital city to another. That's the largest number by far. The second biggest, though, 690,000, which is a whole lot less, that's important to note, is from region to region. So we've got 690,000 people moved from one part of regional Australia to another. The third key element there is the movement to and from between regional Australia and the capital cities. And we can see here that about 500,000 moved from a capital to a regional setting, and around 436,000 moved from a region to a capital city. So we've got a larger flow of people from capitals to regions than we actually had from regions to capitals. And that's where we have this headline number of 65,000 people being the net flow between regional Australia and those capital metros. In total, if we add the region to region movements, we've got about 1.2 million people who in that 5-year period chose to move to a place in regional Australia. We had a bit of a focus in the report on young people. That was for a couple of reasons, mostly because with the regional leaders that we talk to quite frequently, a lot of our inland regional leaders are very concerned about the feeling that their young people are leaving those communities. We know that large numbers of young people and large proportions of young people in our inland communities leave those places when they get to 15 or when they get to 20. They leave for work, they leave for travel, now that's somewhat constrained, so we'll be interested to see whether that pattern changed, international travel at least, or they leave for education. We know from other research, a nice piece of work done a few years ago using the longitudinal survey of Australian youth, that about 30% of those people will move back. But nevertheless, the outflow of those from our inland communities has been of concern. So we thought we'd look specifically at where those young people were moving from and to. Same sort of pattern as the previous table. We've got here, millennials we're defined as people who are 30 to 35-year-old in 2016. Again, the largest number by far is city to city. So we've got about 875,000 people moving from capital city to capital city. Again, though, the next biggest flow is between regions in regional Australia. So a quarter of those, that number, moving around between regions. When we look at the net flows between capital cities and regions for millennials, the pattern is the opposite of what we see for all ages. There is a greater number of millennials who moved from a regional place to a capital city than moved the other way. As a sort of number nerd, that was kind of comforting for me, because if that hadn't been going in that direction, I think it would have been quite hard to explain it. But we have seen a net drift of millennials from regions to capitals. But the biggest number still is that region to region movement. So again, you can see here that we've got about 350,000 people, millennials, who moved to regional Australia in that 5-year period. What was most interesting to us, and one of I think this is the finding I want to highlight from the report for everybody, we had a look at where millennials from cities moved and where millennials from regions moved. And you can see before, the numbers are fairly similar in terms of the total numbers of those movers, but the destinations for those people were quite different. This chart, this map shows the percentage of those new arrivals as a percentage of the base population in each of those local government areas. So if there are 1,000 new millennials in a place of 10,000, they'd have a 10% increase in that. They'd account for a 10% increase in that population. What you can see here is lots of blue places where there's been lots of movement of millennials, and lots of red places where those movement numbers have been really small. The blue places are of two types. We can clearly see the growth in millennial movements to the mining areas, the Pilbara, northwestern WA, some of the other mining areas in Queensland, up around Darwin was a bit of a hotspot. The other area where there are lots of blue areas is what you think of as these sort of really outer peripheral parts of our greater capital cities. So we're looking far-flung parts that are sort of on the edges of Greater Perth, on the edges of Greater Melbourne, on the edges of Greater Sydney. Though I think there are two different motivations there. It's likely that the people going to mining areas were looking for good money and an early start to build their careers. And it's likely, I think, that the other ones moving to these really outer suburban areas are wanting to be close to the capital cities, but don't have the confidence to settle in an inner city, or don't have the confidence or the financial resources to settle within those greater capital city boundaries. The other thing to note with this map, there's a lot of orange spots and red spots, which mean that the flows into those places are really quite small. So that's where millennials from the cities were choosing to go. Now, the pattern for millennials from regions was very different. I've kept the same thresholds here, so we're still looking at the same shares of those newcomers as base population. And what you see here is a really different picture. We've still got highlights in those mining areas, and in fact, they're accentuated a bit. Pilbara, around Darwin, as you can see the mining areas in central West Queensland are popping up. Again, you can see the areas around the outer parts of those greater capitals are also where regional millennials are settling. But what was really interesting to me was there's not a lot of red on this one. So regional millennials are moving to a much wider range of regional places than city-based millennials. If you look at some of these places, central West Queensland particularly, you can see Boulia and Quilpie are there. They're showing up as fairly significant percentages in that base population of new arrivals in millennials. Now, the numbers are not big. I think for Boulia, we're looking at about 60. For Quilpie, we're looking at about 30. For Quilpie, looking at about 60 millennials coming in over that period. So the numbers are not big. They're nowhere near as big as the numbers of millennials moving to those hotspots of Gold Coast and Newcastle and Wollongong and Townsville. But those small numbers are very significant in those small population places. So that's where the dark blue goes. And what's interesting for me too is that lighter bluey green colour, that's really spread around large variety of places that are, some of which are relatively remote and some of which are quite remote. So that says to us that those regional millennials have a greater propensity to live somewhere else regional, even somewhere that's quite remote. And I think that must be around some sort of familiarity, and they know what they're getting themselves into. Even in places where their overall population numbers are actually declining, this map shows us that there's still a steady flow of new young people coming into those places, which is helping to build that sort of long-term demographic resilience in those places. How do we work with mobility? I'm really glad we've got Chris on the panel today. Murray River Shire popped up. So if we step aside from where the large numbers of millennials and where the large numbers of all ages people were going to, the interesting thing for us is when you look under that and look at the share of those movers as that base population. So when we look at the share of people of all ages, the headline, the large places disappear because large numbers are moving to Wollongong and Newcastle and Townsville, but they're not so much a big share of those populations because the populations are so big. But where we've got places, and Murray River popped out, 2,600 new residents from that internal mobility pattern between 2011 and 2016, which was a whopping 22.6% of that overall base population. So a lot of newcomers in Chris's community. Same for Uralla outside of Armidale, Port Stephens on the coast, again, not one of your headline areas, but it's picked up a large number of new residents. Yass Valley on the periphery of Canberra, and Maitland in that sort of central part of the Hunter Valley. So you've got places there which aren't the major places. They're not large regional cities. They're just places that have the right mix of characteristics to attract a sizable number of people of all ages. And so many of those people coming in that they make a significant input into the about 20 or more percent of that local area's population. So they're quite a significant part of those communities. So how do you get yourself, you know, for a lot of places want to attract and retain more people. There's different kinds of attributes that we know. I've done a lot of talking with the media yesterday about what it is that drives young people to these places, what it is that attracts other people. There's a whole range of characteristics. I think people are looking for different sorts of things, but luckily there are lots of us who are looking for those sort of things. So there's often somewhere for everybody. Even the small places can usually find some people who have the who like the sort of the offer that the small places have. So we're looking with our Regional Australia Council 2031. We're going to be working through over the next 6 to 12 months this national campaign to promote the value of regional benefits. This is really important because places are competing for the same sort of people. When we look at the jobs picture, I'm not going to talk about that today. Before COVID, large numbers of jobs across regional Australia, a lot of those high-skilled trades and professions, a lot of regional employers looking for the same sorts of people. So places are going to be competing with each other to get those sort of workers to come in. Town-led campaigns, which we've seen quite a lot of over the years in Australia, they tend to highlight the same features. We've got great lifestyle, affordable housing, good health and education. They're not really differentiated, and it doesn't really make it easy for someone who's not familiar with those places to understand which of those ones are the ones that work for them. We know that various state and federal governments have from time to time introduced various incentives to encourage people to relocate. It's pretty clear from the evaluations of those that small financial incentives don't work. So we need to look more carefully at what it is that can change a person's perception about where they may want to move to. Do they want to move in the first place, and where might that go to? We think that the role of modelling this kind of behaviour from major business is really important, which is why we're so excited about having those council members taking it upon themselves to promote decentralisation of their own workforces, the ability to do work remotely, and in some cases, some of our members are actually, in a sort of strategic way, setting up some of their corporate management systems and corporate management facilities and people deliberately in a regional setting. So that kind of modelling is critical. We know that one of the hesitations that a lot of people have for moving to a regional area for work is that it may be seen as a negative. Oh, you couldn't make it in the city, so you've gone to work in Dubbo or you've gone to work in Mackay. In fact, a lot of the people who've done that have the stories are completely the opposite. They found more responsibilities and more excitement and more rapid career progression from doing that sort of shift as part of their own path. So our national campaign is in over the next 6 to 12 months to push market to outer suburban families and individuals the benefits of regional living. So we'd like to have as much support for that as possible over the next little while. I'll leave it there, Liz. That's a bit of a summary of the main findings of the report, and look forward to questions afterwards.
Great. Thank you very much, Kim, that wide-ranging presentation. As you can see, there is an enormous amount of information within the Big Movers report. It is, in fact, an 80-page report for those interested in taking a deep dive. But now it's time to turn to Nerida, who, as I mentioned earlier, is the Chief Economist at realestate.com and the REA Group. Welcome, Nerida.
Thanks, Liz, and thank you everyone for dialing in today. It was such a pleasure to be invited to speak on regional Australia, primarily because it is such a fascinating area and has been such a fascinating area from a data perspective for quite some time. But COVID-19 lockdowns have really changed the way that many people are searching on realestate.com.au. So we have found growing interest in regional areas. We're starting to see some shifts around the preferences for regional areas. So I'll be talking through that today. I'm also going to talk through a bit about price growth, and I think that's obviously important because on one hand, we can't really get a good idea as to what's happening from house price growth or from search in the same way that Kim's work has been able to do. But it does give us a little bit of an indication of some of the trends that are happening over time. So I'll talk through both search and I'll also talk through what's been happening in terms of house prices. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully I can do this smoothly. So in terms of house price growth, what has been really interesting is how much regional Australia has outperformed many other capital cities over this time period. So you can have a look here at house price growth over the past 3 years, so taking us to the end of May 2020. These are the top growth SA4s, and you can see there a dominance of regional areas coming up on the list. And this is surprising in some ways because, we typically don't always think of regional areas as having very, very strong price growth. People typically think of capital cities having price growth. But what we have seen is just a greater level of stability, that over the past 3 years, we have seen house prices, particularly in Melbourne and Sydney, show very, very high levels of volatility, soaring up until the Financial Services Royal Commission, crashing back down while that occurred, coming back, and then COVID, starting to also make some changes as to what's been happening with pricing. When we have a look at regional areas, they do show very different drivers in terms of their pricing, and a lot of it is related to economic growth. So you can see there Launceston in the northeast coming in as the strongest price growth, 30% house price growth over the past 3 years, really driven off the back of a changing Tasmanian economy, but then also with dominance of regional areas within quite close proximity to Melbourne, for example, so Ballarat, Latrobe, Gippsland, Geelong, Bendigo also appearing there. Geelong, when we have a look at the most popular regional streets in Australia, we track that at probably about every 6 months. Newtown in particular is dominating that list. So, we can see that in Geelong, Newtown is a very popular suburb and likely driven a lot around the fact that in Newtown you can get a great home in Newtown. You can get into the Melbourne CBD quite easily, but it is just so much more affordable. So kind of like I kind of talk about it as being kind of like a Richmond lifestyle, but at a much more affordable price, and allows people to live a much better life. Some New South Wales areas coming in there as well. You can see Central West. Orange at the moment is one of the highest areas we're seeing first home buyer inquiry on realestate.com.au. So we track inquiry with people looking at properties and sending an email to a real estate agent. Orange in particular does seem to be attracting a lot of interest, not just from first home buyers, but also investors. So, lots of interesting things happening in the Central West. And Richmond Tweed, which has been going on for quite some time, pretty much the area down from southern Gold Coast, places like Tugun, heading down to Byron. We have seen very, very strong rental demand in that area for a long time. It is flowing through to pricing as well. So, there's lots and lots of interesting trends that have happened over the past 3 years in regional Australia, and lots of different things driving them. Not showing up as strongly in this data. I guess Mackay would be an example, but we have also seen house prices in mining towns roar back again. So if you have a look at somewhere like Karratha, East Pilbara, over the past 12 months, those local government areas have actually seen over 15% price growth. So when we have a look at mining regions, we did see this big exodus of people. Mining is recovering in Australia. Iron ore is at record level pricing. And as a result, people seem to be coming back into mining towns and really forcing up house prices. Post-COVID lockdowns has been interesting. So this is data that we've been tracking, or we do regularly track it at various different SA4s, suburbs, streets and the like. We look at views per listing. And what's been happening post-COVID-19 lockdowns is we have seen a rapid rise in property across Australia, which is quite surprising. We did expect interest to drop off. But regional Australia has actually seen a bigger increase in interest compared to May 2019. So when we look at those views per listing on realestate.com.au, we've seen this big surge of activity, and regional Australia is really leading the way. We don't know exactly why people are searching. This is one of the challenges we have, is that we can't get the depth of data with regards to demographics in the same way that the work Kim was able to do. But we can see that there's certain locations that people show a preference for. We can also see that a lot of the things that have been happening around the COVID-19 lockdowns are probably driving this. So the two big ones being the fact that many people are likely sick of their small, cramped capital city homes, potentially, living in an apartment when you're forced to work from home and your kids are also at home studying can be very, very difficult. So looking at big regional properties does become far more interesting. But the really big one, which we will see this shift continue to take place, is the fact that we are all just working differently now. That previously most people had to be in a capital city to get to work because commuting is such a nightmare when you live so far away. So the way we work changes more permanently than being close to a capital city office doesn't require us to live in a capital in a big city. We can, the choice of where we live opens up significantly. In terms of regional preferences, these are some of the areas that we see that the highest views per listing. Many of you will know that Mornington Peninsula isn't a regional area. It's not classified as a regional area, but we do classify it just for audience's sake. But Mornington Peninsula has always topped the list in terms of the number of people searching in regional Australia. But you can see there the big changes that have taken place. Well, probably first you can see that the types of places where we do see the highest levels of search. We do see areas located close to capital cities really dominating that, that ability to get affordable housing, as I mentioned, in somewhere like Geelong is a big driver of activity. But what does seem to have happened between now and what's happened with the COVID-19 changes is that we have seen rising interest in luxury areas. So Ballarat and southeast Tasmania, we're on the top 10 in May 2019, driven again affordability, also that Tasmanian economic change that occurred. But what we have now seen is Richmond, Tweed and Southern Highlands and Shoalhaven shoot up the list. So quite interesting. Southern Highlands, right now the most viewed listing on our site is 50 Carters Road in Dural. We have been seeing more and more most viewed listings coming up as regional locations, which is quite unusual. Typically they're in capital cities. But also Richmond Tweed sitting up there. So Richmond Tweed has had that interesting situation with very strong price growth. A lot of change occurring there. I just heard this morning that Zac Efron has moved into the area, so perhaps a little bit of celebrity attracting interest. And interestingly too, we have seen a lot more overseas search going into the Richmond Tweed area. So at one stage, when we looked at UK property seekers, so people looking from the UK into Australia, Byron Bay was actually topping the list. So there's a lot of interest in this area. We do expect to see when we start to get some more updated population moves and particularly by age, we think that what is happening is that there is a large movement, particularly from Sydney. We can see lots of search coming out of Sydney, moving up to that northern New South Wales area, partly because of lifestyle, but also because the fact that they can get jobs there. And it's almost those jobs have been created because of all this population movement up to northern New South Wales. I'm just going to finish off with the suburbs around Australia, regional Australia. We are seeing the highest views per listing at the moment. You can see there that there is quite an interesting mix, but probably what is surprising to me is that we're not really seeing affordability being such a major driver as we perhaps would have seen pre-COVID. Bangalore sitting there at number 1, just east of Byron Bay, has a median house price of $985,000. So you're certainly not getting a bargain in Bangalore. You certainly wouldn't be necessarily moving up there for cheaper housing, but there is obviously enough going on there to really attract interest, and it is likely jobs creation and the like. And then some of the other areas, again, Geelong West, Belmont, Janjak, that Geelong strength we're seeing, and then going forward, a lot of the expenditure on fast rail. There was an announcement for the fast rail project from Geelong into Melbourne. Will continue to accelerate interest in those areas. So I'm now going to hand back to Liz, and I think we'll be going through on the panel.
Thank you, Nerida. Fantastic presentation and really wonderful to see, as we suspected, that surge in interest in regional property. And perhaps the Bangalore searching is all about us spending some time dreaming about what life might be like outside of Byron Bay. But thank you for that presentation. So now it's my pleasure to welcome Chris Bilkey, who is the Mayor of the Murray River Council. For those, I'm sure Chris will tell us his exact location, but it's in the southernmost corner of New South Wales, and he lives in the town of Moama, which is just down the road from where I grew up in Deniliquin. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Liz, appreciate it. And thank you to the to the RAI for the invitation. And congratulations on the report. It's a fantastic report that has great relevance for local government areas such as ours, and will certainly contribute to our own planning and to understand the issues that impact on attracting people to our area. 22.6% of our population. Well, we had 22.6% of our population coming in to the LGA, according to Kim, which kind of begs the question: we must be losing a lot too to have that number coming in, and yet our population not going up by anything like that amount. But nonetheless, it's a very, very good indicator that people are attracted to the area. Some of whom are staying, some of whom are leaving subsequently, or others are leaving as well. Just a thumbnail on Murray River Council. We're a relatively low population local government area in the Southern Riverina, as Liz said. We stretch from the Chuka-Moama towns northwest along the Murray for 250 kilometres, past Barham and up to Toolibuk, and then north up to near Balranald, and then back in a southeasterly direction to Deniliquin, and then down to Chuka-Moama again. So 12,000 square kilometres, about the same number of people. So we're not a dense LGA, densely populated anyway. We might be dense in other ways. And we're surrounded by rivers. Rivers on our southwestern border, rivers on our northern border, and rivers on our northwestern border, the Murrumbidgee and the Edward River. So we're a vast floodplain in effect. Our economy is driven by agriculture, always has been and will be for the foreseeable future, but we're underpinned by a very strong tourism industry as well. And that relates to the environment of the rivers, particularly, and the proximity of those rivers to Melbourne, the ability to get to those rivers for visitors from Melbourne and from other regional places in Victoria. We're a New South Wales LGA, but most of our visitors come from Victoria, as you'd expect. The agricultural industry is a mix of dry and irrigated agriculture, and that's under significant stress because of drought and climate change. For example, our dairying industry has almost entirely disappeared from our footprint, and other water-dependent agricultural pursuits are under stress, such as the rice industry. Tourism is a strong backup, as I said, and unlike many LGAs that are agriculturally dependent, the impact of drought and climate change is somewhat softened, or has been in the past, by a fairly strong tourism industry. And that has not been the case, of course, since COVID hit. So we've had a double whammy, although I'd have to say from an agricultural point of view, it's been lucky that we've had the best start to a season we've had in 20 years, probably. After tourism comes manufacturing and service industries, and a lot of those are service industries related to that tourism industry as well. Education and health, of course, round that out. Our demographics are that we've got a high and a growing percentage of over 55s. We are a favoured destination for retirees, particularly from Victoria, and the growth in that category drives our growth more than anything else, despite the influx of some millennials as well. We have some steady percentages represented by the 0 to 24s as a percentage of our total, which is great. They're holding their own despite the growth in the aged percentage. Our declining group is in that 35 to 54-year-old group, and that's what causes us greatest concern, because these are the millennials or potential millennials fairly soon, and they're drivers of economies. These are people who have families, who have jobs, who drive employment, and so on. So that's a challenge for us as a council. In addition to those demographic factors, we have a geographic split between those who are along the river in the townships and those who are in the more remote communities. Those remote communities tend to be the agriculturally dependent ones, and we have a major challenge as a council to support those communities as we go forward, because those communities are going to depend upon agricultural health, and that in turn is going to depend on innovation and adaptation in the agricultural space. So what lies behind our demographics? Well, the increasing 55, as I mentioned, are mostly retirees from Melbourne. Why are they coming? They're coming for lifestyle, they're coming for affordability, they're coming for proximity to Melbourne, they're coming for healthcare and services. And they're coming because they've had experience with the area, principally through holidaying here. So many people come and stay as holiday makers when they're working lives, and then decide that it's a great place to come. And the average house price in Moama is around $350,000. It's easy to see that if you sell a house in Melbourne worth $800,000 or $1 million, you can put a lot of change in your pocket buying a house in Moama. So I think the key determinant, or the key challenge for us, is how we address the issue of those millennials who are becoming a smaller percentage of our population. And the answer for me is that we need to have a persistent focus on the creation of jobs, the creation of job opportunities in our communities, to ensure that they have a reason to come here other than the affordability and livability issues, which many LGAs offer. We've got to be able to provide jobs for them. Clearly, they need to have good education options, both primary and secondary, and potentially tertiary. They need public and private education options. They need healthcare options. They need GPs, they need specialists, they need hospitals, and they need ancillary healthcare specialty services as well. And increasingly, they need an arts and culture background in their community. They need a place where they feel as though there's a sense of creativity in their community, which perhaps doesn't attract them in the first place, but in my experience encourages them to stay when they are here. The world is changing. One of the advantages we have is this is a critical mass issue for us. We are fortunate enough to share the river at Moama with Echuca on the Victorian side, and that combined population constitutes about 25,000 people. Now, if I have any, it's been said before that there's nothing wrong with a rural community that can't be fixed by a good long stretch of beach. But if you're inland, that's fairly hard to come by. But if there is a substitute for a beach, then it's a town in close proximity that gives you that critical mass, because that mass delivers things like education, like healthcare, and so on, that create that fill the blanks for many people who are looking for a long-term place to live. So going forward, I think remote learning is increasingly part of our education offerings, and we're seeing that becoming a reality for many, many people in places like ours. Communication technology, as we've understood through the COVID crisis, has brought our families and our friends closer together and more accessible than ever has been the case before. And I think we've learned a lot from that experience. I think technology has that capacity to diminish distance quite dramatically. And I think the affordability gradient, the price gradient between metropolitan and regional and rural will persist, although it may diminish somewhat in size. It will continue to persist, and that will be a driver for us as well. So challenges for us, and I suspect many rural LGAs, but there are a lot of overlaps in terms of the challenges that we face. So thanks, Liz.
Thank you, Chris. Look, perhaps I'm hopeful, but perhaps the regionalisation of the workforce may assist in that creation of jobs that you talked about. So we may see a very different new normal. So thank you very much. Now, I'd like to open up to questions. We have had them coming in. And one that just landed on my desk was, are the presentations going to be available? So I just wanted to say up front that yes, they are, in particular Nerida and Kim's presentation, so they will be available to everyone involved. But firstly, I'm going to open up now to some of our participants, and we're going to hear the first question from Liz de Chastel, and I believe this question's to be directed to Kim. Welcome, Liz.
Oh, hi, Kim. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, hi. Look, I just wanted to sort of talk about some of the issues that have arisen from COVID. We've got the closure of international borders at the moment, and that's obviously going to slow down growth in the cities. So the cities are going to be starting to try and, you know, compete with each other, if you like, to keep people in the cities or to get more people in the cities. So I'm just wondering if that throws up a couple of extra challenges for regional areas, and but also are there opportunities offered with COVID as well, you know, like people wanting to move out of cities or to be in safer places or to work remotely. So interested in your comments on that. Thank you. And I should say I'm from the Australian Local Government Association, and this discussion's been fantastic. Thank you very much, and thank you to the Mayor as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz.
Thanks, Liz. It's a great question. I think our labour market's in a real mess at the moment, because we've got areas in with sort of relatively, funnily enough, still parts of the economy that are short-staffed, and particularly in a lot of regional places, because, as you say, those international borders and even the domestic borders closing have really mucked up the flow of short-term labour into our regional places. And the long-term flows of those migrants. We've been getting about 250,000 new immigrants a year, new residents a year. I mean, most of those, as you say, going to Melbourne and Sydney. That's a lot of people. Now that flow's going to be almost non-existent for this calendar year, and that will have a long tail, I think, in terms of housing demand. I mean, Nerida is going to be a very interesting pattern with that. People, developers and builders have been relying on those steady flows for decades. If the taps turned off overnight. So yes, that'll have a big impact all across the country, and it'll have a very long tail. No matter what we're able to do in terms of rebuilding the economy after, as we recover from COVID, that migration story is going to have a very long tail and a very long level of influence on our place. My only sort of, I think there are lots of opportunities for regions, people wanting to get out of the city. Some of those, I think, to be honest, will be sort of affordability questions. If we've got very large numbers of people unemployed and underemployed at the moment. Hanging on JobKeeper. JobKeeper is a real paradox, because I think it keeps people in place so long as those subsidies are there. When the JobKeeper subsidies stop, that's going to leave a lot of people sort of stuck, I suspect, in a sort of high income, sort of a high cost lifestyle without any income. So whether we'll see a significant sort of shift of those people to a more affordable location based on necessity, I'm not sure. It's very hard to predict, because our labour market is in such a muddle at the moment, with people who are tethered to employers but are actually underemployed, as well as employers really looking for workers as well. So it's very hard to know. I think it's going to be a bit of both. I think there will be opportunities for some regions, and I think broadly, as we sort of discussed earlier, some of these trends run quite deep, and there is this sort of steady flow of people who are looking for that regional lifestyle. But it's very hard to predict at the moment, I think, how that's going to play out exactly over the next few months.
Thank you. Great question, Liz. Look, the next one I have is from a Tanya Breeze. You still with us, Tanya?
Yes, hello, I'm still here.
Welcome.
Yeah, look, I guess I know we've been talking a lot from kind of people living in an urban area, that some of those positive benefits that we've seen come out of COVID that people are hoping to continue. So, more working from home, less traffic, people are more connected to their neighbours and their local communities. But I'm just curious as to what that experience has been like for people living in regional areas, and whether they've seen kind of any, I guess, positive changes since COVID.
Chris, maybe you'd like to answer that one for us. Just you're on mute there, Chris.
I'm interested in that comment, Tanya, about your increased perception of a sense of community as a result of COVID. And it's one of the things I think that people living in regional areas and rural areas have a great sense of already. And it's one of the great benefits that I've seen as a previous inhabitant, long-term inhabitant of Sydney, coming back to a region like this or a rural area like this. Strikes you so quickly and immediately that there's a sense of community in smaller regional towns and so on. And if that has been one of the results of the COVID lockdown, then that's fantastic. Whether that sense will persist beyond then, I'm not sure. I think a realisation of the value of a sense of community is fantastic glue for that's felt by these smaller communities such as ours. The sense that you can reach out and touch, metaphorically anyway, the whole of that community binds people together very, very much. So I hope it persists everywhere.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Tanya, for that question. Look, I'm just going to jump in. We really are a little short of time, but I'll take the chair's prerogative. Nerida, we've heard a lot about the housing prices potentially plummeting, particularly in the metropolitan areas. And I just wondered what your thoughts are on, given your long-range trend on the stability of the regional property market, which was really interesting to us. What are your thoughts for regional property now in a COVID and post-COVID world?
Yeah, I mean, prices have remained remarkably steady. I know, I wasn't alone when the COVID-19 lockdowns hit that, I thought we would see a rapid plummeting in pricing. I think what did happen as we moved through the weeks is that a lot of the stimulus packages started to really stabilise things, particularly that third stimulus package that was announced, the JobKeeper package. We started to see a resurgence in search activity. We did see a drop off in listings, so we started to see this imbalance in supply and demand, which was occurring. So, it has remained far more stable, and I guess, depending if you're a buyer or seller, it's far more positive than we expected. There are areas of weakness, and there are areas where we saw very, very high levels of development, particularly apartments, and primarily because renters were very adversely affected immediately because a lot of them were highly exposed to job loss. And we also saw a rise in Airbnb listings being converted from Airbnb short-term to long-term. And then a lot of students didn't arrive back from overseas. We saw a lot of kids moving back home with those students. So there was a lot of dynamics that really impacted high development areas. In terms of pricing in regional areas, at this stage, it does look like what's happening is supporting the areas which are within commuting distance from capital cities. It's not surprising. I think a lot of people would, they love the idea of regional, but they do still have that attachment to a capital city because of their jobs. I think though over time, it will be interesting to see how many of us get back to the office. And I think this will be the potential big game changer with regards to movement, that if we don't need to go to the office anymore and we can work literally anywhere, then it does free us up in terms of choice. And then I think there's just, again, a lot of the things that were happening pre-COVID are still happening, that we've got this movement to mining towns at the moment because mining is recovering. We've got this movement to places like Orange and northern New South Wales and Geelong and Bendigo, and those trends seem to be still happening. So I guess this continuation of trend is another feature.
Wonderful, thank you. Look, we have sadly ran out of time, so I am sorry. I can see that there's a further 20 odd questions there banked up, but we'll do our best to take a look at those and perhaps provide answers after today's event. Look, it's been a tremendous discussion, really wide-ranging panelists, and each of your presentations have added a different dimension to today's theme on the big population reveal. So thank you very, very much for your time and for being with us today. For those listeners, we'd love to hear your feedback. We will be sending out a feedback form later today, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on the Big Movers report. And if there's anything that we can do as an institute to help you in your regions better understand your strengths and weaknesses. We do a lot of work around attraction and retention strategies, so we'd love to work with anyone right across Australia. I guess some of the other big projects that we're currently working on, as Kim mentioned, is the campaign. So again, anybody interested in working with us on that, please reach out to speak to us. Finally, I again would love to just thank our partner and sponsor for the Regions Rising series, Bendigo and Adelaide Bank and the Community Enterprise Foundation. Thank you very, very much for your ongoing support. We couldn't do this without you. And we look forward to bringing you our third webinar later in July. And we'll be taking a bit of a deeper dive on the employment market. Each quarter, our Chief Economist, Kim, puts out a quarterly vacancy index, and we're obviously expecting to see quite a different 3-month trend. And so Kim will be unpacking what it means across our great nation for employment in a COVID, and I guess thinking our way out of COVID. So watch this space. We'll be bringing that event to you shortly as we finalise the details. But on that note, sorry to have gone a little bit over time. Again, to all of the participants with us today, thank you for your time, participation and support of the Institute. Thank you to our speakers, and we look forward to you joining us again very soon. Thank you.